Welcome, everybody. This is I'm both sad and happy to say the last hearing of the International People's Tribunal on U.S. imperialism, sanctions, blockades, and economic coercive measures. We've been conducting hearings since the very end of January or beginning of February, almost either on a monthly or biweekly, and then sometimes weekly basis. With about 15 to 17 countries throughout the world. It's been incredibly enlightening and a learning experience and a movement building experience for us, and really transformative. We are grateful to all the witnesses that have participated, all the jurors that have participated with diligence and commitment, and all of the steering committee members who have been organizing this for many, many months now, for over 2 years now. Our closing session will be to celebrate our work and to discuss how we plan to move forward, because in many respects, this is just the beginning for us. We do plan to move forward with some concrete tasks and strategies. Our closing session to discuss those and also celebrate is going to be at the People's Forum in New York City on September 29th and 30th. If you would like to attend, you can sign up at the People's Forum website. Dinner will be provided on Friday evening with a panel of notables, politically notable folks, in addition to movement folks. Saturday morning, we'll have a rapporteurs panel moderated by Karina Mullen, who's here today, who will describe the findings that we've arrived at, and the patterns that we're seeing and things like that, and then our next steps. And then Saturday afternoon, our panel of jurors will read the verdict and then describe what they've witnessed over the last many months. So I highly encourage you to attend. It will be streamed. The whole thing will be live streamed, but if you're able to attend in person, I highly encourage you to attend in person. So with that, I'm going to open it up to our panel. When we initially began this process, we landed on 15 or 16 countries throughout Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And then over time, we realized the necessity of including some of the quote unquote colonies, which are also nations. We voted to include Puerto Rico, Hawaii, and the US Virgin Islands. And Michael Deutsch, one of our esteemed jurors here, is the person who urged us to include Puerto Rico. We held the US Virgin Islands hearing a few weeks ago, last month, and it was incredibly enlightening in illuminating how the circumstances that sanctioned peoples and nations are subject to are actually incredibly similar to the circumstances that colonized people are subject to. And what this has affirmed our original proposition that modern sanctions regimes are actually a modified form of modern colonialism. So we are incredibly excited to hear from our esteemed witnesses today, who all have a lot of experience in the Puerto Rican liberation movement from different angles. And we hope that this is just the beginning of a broader conversation about what sanctions really are and what they mean for the world. Karina Mullen will be moderating one of the steering committee members will be moderating the question and answer period. So at the end of the witness testimonies, I'll hand it over to Karina. Our first speaker today will be Wilma Esther Reveron Colatro, and I'm just going to read your bio, Wilma. She founded and directed the Office for International Information on Puerto Rico's Independence, located in New York, from 1980 to 1985, concentrating on educational efforts at the United Nations on the case of Puerto Rico before the Decolonization Committee. She's the president of the Comité Puerto Rico on la ONU from 1996 to 2010 and oversaw it. And as Secretary of International Relations for Movimiento Independentista Nacional Ostosiano, has participated and spoken at ministerial meetings and head of state summits of the non-aligned movement. She is currently senior counsel at Weisbrod, Mateus, and Copley in insurance litigation, but previously worked in private practice in employment and family law and human rights issues. She was the first vice president of the Puerto Rican Bar Association and the president of the Puerto Rican Bar Association Commission on Human Rights. She's also a member of the Puerto Rican Bar Association's Commission for the Study of Constitutional Development and has received 2 principal distinctions conveyed by the Puerto Rican Bar Association for human rights work, the Nilita Vientos Medal and the Gilberto Concepcion de Gracia Medal. Her columns continue to appear in Puerto Rico's principal newspaper, El Nuevo Dia, Claridad, El Vocero, and other printed and web publications. And she's made numerous appearances before the Special Committee on Decolonization annual hearings on the question of Puerto Rico and at the Caribbean and Pacific regional seminars as an expert on decolonization themes. Welcome, Wilma. Thank you very much for joining us.
Well, thank you very much for having me here today. I think that when you have dedicated many years of your life to advancing the question of Puerto Rico at both the domestic and the international level, it is important any opportunity you have to bank on the experience that you have gained, and most important is to share it. That's the stage that I am in my life right now, having already reached the 70 years old. And I really look forward to sharing and trying to form new young people to keep on to take on the baton of the international fight for Puerto Rico's independence and self-determination. So I'm going to speak to you today about the question of Puerto Rico at the international level, and especially in the theme of the right for reparations. That's one theme that has not been worked or demanded enough in the struggle for Puerto Rican independence. There have been some people who have actually written about it, like Pedro Malaves, like Angel Falcón, like Raquel Maldonado, who is a PhD student. And then I also drafted an essay in 2012, which I pretend to someday update it. And I think that it's important that when we talk about Puerto Rico's plight under colonialism, in order to not convey a message of that we are facing an incredible, powerful nation, which is the United States with all its economic and military force, our people need to know that a transition to independence is not jumping out of an airplane without parachute. That we have a right to reparations that the United States owe us for the 125 years in which they have held us under colonialism, and for all the crimes against humanity that they have committed against us during those 125 years. So basically, the United States itself has a history on the question of reparations. The first one that we can pinpoint and also denounce of their lack of respect to the agreements and the commitments they have made to the Afro-American population in the United States. That first reparation that they adopted was the the famous 40 acres and 1 mule that they were going to give to the people who had been under slavery after the Civil War in the 1900s. But as you know, even though that was adopted as a measure that they were going to establish for the newly freed slaves in the United States, they didn't meet that commitment. And when the next president came on after Abraham Lincoln, I don't remember the name of this president, which is really doesn't have any meaningful participation in US history. But besides being the one that did not carry on the commitment to give the newly freed slave the right to have some basis to start an economy of themselves, which was the purpose of the 40 acres and 1 mule promise after the Civil War. So the US has made commitments of reparations besides with the Afro-American community that they did not completely meet. They also made reparations. They actually made reparations, for example, to the Filipino people after they gained independence for some of the damages that they had sustained by using the Philippines as a military base during the World War II. So there's a lot of initiatives within the Afro-American community and the Caribbean communities to obtain reparations for the crime of slavery and for all the economic exploitation suffered under the colonial powers. There is a movement, there's an international movement which is spearheaded by Saint Vincent and Grenadines for reparations to the descendants of the slaves of the Caribbean. So there is some kind of history, precedents, and framework within the United States history and legal system regarding reparations that we can take some experience about them and implement them in the demand for reparations for the people of Puerto Rico. Now, there's also international obligations of the states that belong to the United Nations that support the right for reparation. The United Nations has what they call the principles of it has a very long name, so you excuse me for a second so I can tell you the full name, so anybody that wants to access these principles can look them up. It's a resolution 6147, and it's the principles for the, here it is, principles and guidelines on the right to a remedy and reparation for victims of gross violation of international human rights law and serious violations of international human rights, humanitarian law. Now, these are principles that the United Nations have put forward. The problem with the principles is that they are non-binding, but they are part of what is called the body of international law, in which the resolutions of the General Assembly and the customary principles are, when you put them together, they form the basis of international law. And since this resolution, it has been adopted by the United Nations as part of their commitment to advance towards the eradication of decolonization in the world. So they do have some persuasive force. Let's call it persuasive because it's not legally binding. But the member states of the United Nations are supposed to guide themselves by these principles that are tied to the United Nations Charter, which establishes the principle of self-determination as one of the basic the basic hopes of humanity for having a world without exploitation and to gain peace in the world. The colonialism has been recognized of one of the sources of conflict in the world, and that has to be addressed and has to be solved once and for all. As you know, Puerto Rico has been a colony of the United States since 1898, 125 years now. Previous to that, we have been a colony of Spain for almost 500 years. So Puerto Rico has never really gained, has had access after the invasion of Spain and colonialism of Spain. We have never had the opportunity to develop really as a state with full self-determination. So with US imperialism coming into Puerto Rico, we have identified several aspects of the international principles that we can apply in our quest for reparations for colonialism. One is, of course, restitution. Let me look at the list to make sure I tell them all. Restitution, compensation, rehabilitation, satisfaction, and guarantee of non-repetition. And we add to that the right to access information. Now, when we talk about restitution, we're basically talking about the right to obtain, to be again the owners of our lands in which the US has established, for example, military bases and other lands they occupy as part of the system they have established in Puerto Rico of federal government with courts and the FBI and the whole apparatus of the US system in Puerto Rico. The most egregious example of what we have to demand in terms of restitution of land are the islands of Vieques and Culebra, especially Vieques, which is still, even though they have ceased doing the maneuvers and military practices in the island of Vieques, but they still under the U.S. Wild federal U.S. Wild and Fish Administration, they have control of still a lot of the lands in Vieques that were used. And we have to add to that the problem of the contamination of those lands. We want them restituted, but we want them restituted in their natural, the best natural manner in which they were taken. And we want them to be clean up. Now, they made a commitment to clean the island of Vieques, but the problem is that what they were doing was what is called the open burning and open detonation. And that created another problem of chemicals being sent on the atmosphere, in the lands, surrounding where they did this open, this is what they call OBs and OD, open burning and open detonation. Right now, I don't know if you're aware that in the US, in the federal court of South Carolina, there's a big litigation related to what is called as PFAS, which is what they call the forever chemicals, which are used by the all the firefighters. Foams are used with these PFAS chemicals inside them because they are retardants of fire, and all the firefighters gears are also contaminated with PFAS. So there's a litigation right now against the manufacturers, which of course are the usual suspects, 3M, these big DuPont, all these big manufacturers of chemical. And Vieques will have the right to join that litigation. Hopefully, we are trying to get them involved in that litigation, since the litigation against the U.S. Defense Department itself failed because of technicalities of jurisdiction and status of limitation and that kind of thing. So they will be able to claim against the manufacturers of PFAS and at least get individual compensation for the damages that they have received. So that's one example of restitution. I'm talking about Vieques because it's like the poster child of what will restitution mean under an agreement with the United States for independence and in their returning the lands to the people of Puerto Rico. Then there's compensation, which can be a monetary compensation for the damages, all the other damages that they have caused to Puerto Rico. And of course, there's, besides the presence of the U.S. military and all the damages that they have done, we have all those U.S. companies. You know, Puerto Rico was a haven for pharmaceuticals, and so we belong to the Superfund, and especially the towns of Barceloneta, Sidra, and the towns where a lot of pharmaceuticals have been established, which are phasing out because they were there because it was attractive for a 10-year exemption of taxes, and so now they all have been packing and going to the next victim because they don't want them in U.S. territory, but they're leaving behind bodies of water contaminated with mercury and other kinds of chemicals. So that the people who have been damaged by these pharmaceuticals operations in Puerto Rico will be entitled to monetary compensation for those damages. Then there is the rehabilitation, which will mean that what I mentioned before about cleaning up whatever damage that they have done to the land and the people of Puerto Rico. There's the satisfaction, which is the U.S. recognizing that it has caused damages through its imperial presence in Puerto Rico. And there's the guarantee of non-repetition. And of course, it's very important, the right to information, because the right to information entails the right of people to organize themselves and to be able to effectively demand the reparations of the damages of colonialism. One of the things that the U.S. has to recognize is, for example, the persecution of the people who have fought for the independence of Puerto Rico. As you know, in Puerto Rico was one of the victims of the COINTELPRO program that was put in motion by the FBI under the leadership of Edgar J. Hoover. Puerto Rico independence leaders were targeted and they were exposed to psychological warfare, trying to destabilize them, and they were effective in some cases. The case of Filiberto Ojeda, which when we're talking about persecution and repression, we include assassination, which was a case of Filiberto Ojeda Rios, which they ambushed and surrounded when he was at his home in Plan Bonito in Hormiguero, and he was wounded. They could see the blood coming, streaming down the door where he was. There was a doctor in place. Our compañero Dr. Hector Pesquera was there pleading with the FBI to allow him to go and give Filiberto Ojeda some attention, which could have saved his life. And they wouldn't allow it. They just let him bled to death. So that's one of the most dramatic examples, but we also have the case of Pedro Albizu Campos, how he was incarcerated and exposed to radiation and destroy his health, his physical health. He had what I can call a premature death, because when you die in your 60s, you still could have 20 or 30 more productive years in life. At least I hope so. It's Pedro Albizu Campo, Filiberto Ojeda Rios are examples of torture, of assassination, and there's this whole mechanism of repression that has been put in Puerto Rico. In Pedro Albizu Campo case, for example, when they took him to federal court the first time, the jury came with a not guilty verdict. So what they did is they incarcerated him again, and then they put a low U.S. white American in the jury, and they ensured that he was going to be found guilty. So those are only some of the examples of what the U.S. has done, including with the legal system of the U.S. in Puerto Rico, the federal court, that have been there to implement all the actions that the U.S. wants to take against Puerto Rican independent leader, like they did, for example, during the Vietnam War with the Puerto Ricans that refused to join the U.S. military because we didn't understand that we had any problems, any conflict with the Vietnamese people. That was not our war, but still our young people were drafted. At that time, there was the Servicio Militar Obligatorio, which you could not refuse. If you refused, you went to jail. So a lot of young Puerto Ricans gave their life in that war in Vietnam. And we also have persons like Oscar Lopez, who he has even bronze medal for his courage during the Vietnam War and saving his fellow soldiers, and how that in the case of Oscar, it gave him a wonderful insight of what the imperialism was when he participated as a soldier in Vietnam. We have also the right to our culture, which has been affected by the U.S. They imposed the English language in Puerto Rico until 1948 with the English language in the educational system. In the schools in Puerto Rico, they were taught in English by Puerto Rican teachers that could barely speak the language, and the whole educational system, all the books, everything was in English. So most of the young people that went through that system, of course, they did not have the opportunity to develop fully because they were being taught in a language that it was not their own. In 1948, the Puerto Rico legislature passed a law which then made mandatory the Spanish as the language to be used in Puerto Rico's education system. But those years from 1998 until the 1948, 1898 to 1948, those were 50 years that were lost for the Puerto Rican people in terms of development of their language and their history and their culture. There has also been the imposition of a history of Puerto Rico, which does not account for the grievous actions of the United States, which it, is always trying to put as models the U.S. heroes and ignore completely the history of the Puerto Rican heroes like Ramón Emeterio Betances, like Pedro Albizu Campo, and the women like Lola Rodriguez de Tio, etc. So Mariana Bracetti. So those heroes are not taught in school at all because the educational system is geared towards maintaining people on their sense of not being able to manage their lives or their nation by their own, that they have to be completely dependent of the US in order to survive. And that is a egregious damage that needs, this comes within what we said before of the right to access information in order to cure this distortion of the Puerto Rican history. I remember plainly in my first grade that the social study book will start by saying that Puerto Rico was a small island surrounded by water. Yeah, okay, it's an island, of course, and that it had no natural resources, and that we could not economically exist by ourselves. And then we see around us all these sovereign island nations like Grenada and like Trinidad and Tobago and like Jamaica, which are not only surviving, but in some of the cases are even thriving. So that's what we have been exposed to historically. And I don't know how much time have I run because I don't want to take the time of others.
You only have a few more minutes. Maybe just wrap up if you can, please.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, so I just want to let you know that first that I'm available to, if you want me to share information on the reparations team, I can send you a copy of the essay I wrote in 2012. I can give you the latest writing that of this, for example, this PhD student, Raquel Maldonado, which is excellent. And we think that this coming together of the people of Puerto Rico with the people of the US and also with our people in the diaspora is strategically important and should be a priority for all of us. So I really thank you for giving us the opportunity to share some of this information today.
Thank you very, very much, Wilma. That was a wonderful presentation. Now I will introduce our next speaker, Lourdes Garcia, who goes by Lulu. Lulu was born in Naguabo, Puerto Rico, and raised primarily between the Lower East Side of Manhattan and Puerto Rico. Lulu comes from a working-class family and was shaped by passionate and outspoken political activists of all stripes. Lulu became involved as a teenager in the struggles for Puerto Rican independence, for the democratic rights of the Puerto Rican community in the US, and the struggle for women's rights and the working class here and throughout the world. Throughout her life, Lulu has also been involved in solidarity work with Latin America and the Caribbean. Lulu was a member of the coordinating committee of the 33 Mujeres for Oscar Lopez Rivera, which sought the freedom of Puerto Rican political prisoner Oscar Lopez Rivera. Lulu is also a co-founder and current member of Call to Action on Puerto Rico, which was formed in July 2015 to create awareness of and denounce the colonial crisis of Puerto Rico and to struggle for Puerto Rico's independence. We welcome you, Lulu. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. And thank you for inviting me to be part of this critically important tribunal. The 125-year-old U.S. colonial domination of Puerto Rico has had, as we've heard from Wilma, devastating consequences for every aspect of Puerto Rican life. Puerto Rico's unstable economy and poverty triggered by US imperialist exploitation, racism, and disregard for our people and resources, along with the colonial elite's historic corruption, mismanagement, and contempt towards our people, has led to many far-reaching and traumatic generational consequences. One of them is the continued displacement of Puerto Rico's population, primarily to the US. What is not often understood is that when people leave, they take with them critical aspects of a nation's experience, skills, history, culture, and memories, which leave a gap, a space, both in the nation left behind and in the communities formed by the diaspora in the new land. The continuous poverty and economic instability faced by Puerto Ricans, caused in large part by failed US economic policies and crises, which directly impact Puerto Rico, have forced Puerto Ricans to migrate for almost as long as we have been a colony of the United States. If we consider that Puerto Ricans were migrating and going to work in Hawaii at the turn of the last century. The largest waves of migration took place after the end of World War II, when the US began to change Puerto Rico's economy from an agricultural one to one based on manufacturing products for exports. The so-called success of this new economic plan, which was unveiled and implemented in the 50s as Operation Bootstrap, called for major tax incentives for US corporations, which took their profits out of the island, a pool of cheap labor, and an aggressive campaign to control the population as a safety valve against social unrest caused by the massive displacement and unemployment of the rural workers and the population growth. This campaign included pushing migration to the US and a sterilization program aimed primarily at Puerto Rican women, which saw 30% of Puerto Rican women of childbearing age sterilized between the 50s and the 70s. Many Puerto Ricans who migrated to the US found jobs in factories, hotels, and restaurants, and as migrant farm workers, among other jobs throughout the US. But many faced unemployment, overcrowded and miserable housing conditions, and lack of quality healthcare and insurance. Many struggled to adapt as they came with the expectation that at last they would receive the same benefits that other US citizens had supposedly been receiving here. Instead, Puerto Ricans were confronted with the reality that they were second-class citizens subjected to the racism and danger of the existing Jim Crow system, constant discrimination and harassment when they spoke Spanish, ate different foods, played loud music, and practiced a quote-unquote foreign culture and religion. Puerto Ricans were also accused of bringing diseases and of being criminals, and as such had to struggle to find decent housing and health care. But we Puerto Ricans fought back then and continue to fight against the discrimination and racism we have faced throughout the decades. Different generations of Puerto Ricans have been schooled by justice movements in the US, like the Civil Rights Movement, as well as by revolutionary organizers and activists like the Black Panther Party, and by organizers in the struggles to organize and unionize the shops and farms that we have worked in. In this case, also Cesar Chavez, who was organizing the farm workers, and there were many Puerto Rican migrant workers as well. We have taken up the struggles for decent housing, healthcare, bilingual education, and other democratic rights wherever we are found in the US. Today, according to a 2021 study prepared by the Center for Puerto Rican Studies at CUNY Hunter College, utilizing the latest US Census, the current population of Puerto Ricans living in virtually every state in the United States is 5,798,287. Let me repeat that, 5,798,287, with New York and Florida having the highest concentrations, while the population of Puerto Ricans in Puerto Rico is 3,128,427. Again, let me repeat that, 3,128,427, making the Puerto Rican diaspora larger than the Puerto Rican population in the archipelago. Such a large presence of Puerto Ricans here in the US and the continued arrival of Puerto Ricans means that the elephant in the room, that is the colonial status of Puerto Rico, cannot be ignored. Many Puerto Ricans who are migrating today do so because they are being stripped of their most basic services by the Fiscal Control Board, or La Junta, established under Obama when he signed the PROMESA Act, the Puerto Rico Oversight, Management, and Economic Stability Act, in 2016 to force Puerto Rico to pay an odious debt to Wall Street vultures. Puerto Ricans arriving in the US for the first time not only experience some of the culture shocks of previous generations as they struggle to learn and adapt to a completely different way of life, but are faced with the current wave of anti-immigrant hatred directed at migrants. Some of the anti-immigrant issues Puerto Ricans have recently faced involved employees of Spirit Airlines, Hertz Car Rental, and CVS Pharmacy. In April of this year, just to give you some examples, a couple, Luis and Marivivi Roman Torres, were returning to Puerto Rico from LA. When they went to the ticket agent, they produced their Puerto Rican IDs, but the agent didn't accept them and asked them to produce their passports. And according to the agent, which they had and presented, but they were denied boarding because their 2-year-old toddler didn't have a US passport. And according to the agent, the flight to Puerto Rico was an international flight requiring passports, which we Puerto Ricans actually don't require when we have to travel within and between the US and Puerto Rico. They eventually made it back home on a more expensive JetBlue flight. Spirit Airlines later apologized and refunded their tickets, stating, quote, "In this specific case, an agent at LAX who is new to the position misunderstood the identification requirements. We are providing the agent with additional coaching and reiterating proper procedure." Another incident, the second one, took place in May of this year when Humberto Marchan was denied a prepaid car rental by a Hertz employee at Louis Armstrong New Orleans International Airport. The agent there demanded to see his passport instead of his license because she did not believe Marchan's driver's license was real. A police officer was called to the scene by the Hertz employee, who then accused Marchan of creating a disturbance. When Marchan walked away, he heard the policeman saying he would call the border authorities. This incident also made the news, and Hertz reimbursed his car rental and apologized, stating, "We are reinforcing our policies with employees to ensure that they are understood and followed consistently across our locations." Finally, another incident took place on October 25, 2019, when Jose Guzman Payano, a junior at Purdue University, went to his local CVS store to purchase some Mucinex. He had a cold. While completing the self-checkout, the CVS employee approached him and asked him for his identification. He provided her with his driver's license, which was from Puerto Rico, but the employee repeatedly told him that the store could not accept his identification, then asked him for his visa. Guzman provided a US passport, but the CVS employee would still not accept his passport, which showed that he was born in Puerto Rico, as a valid form of ID, and instructed him to provide documentation that verified his immigration status. He eventually left without the medication for his cold. His mother used Facebook to post the incident, which led to more than 10,000 shares, and CVS apologizing, stating, "While we are confident that this was an isolated incident, we will be reiterating to all of our stores the correct procedures to follow when requesting identification that is required by law for certain transactions, as well as the forms of identification we accept, including ID issued by US territories such as Puerto Rico." Let me just say that on a personal note, I often carry my US passport, as much as it galls me to have to carry it. It is a passport that also shows that I was born in Puerto Rico. It says Puerto Rico, USA, which makes me crazy. But I take it because in different social settings, I have been stopped. I am also concerned about proving my status. I have always been aware of the vulnerability and dangers faced by people who look like me, especially when I have been followed by department store detectives profiling me as a potential shoplifter, or have been asked if I had checked the price of an item I wanted to purchase, as if I didn't have the money to do so, or asked why I was standing in front of the building I live in. But I'm even more careful now than I was before because of this situation that migrants are facing and that many of us are facing who look like and who are Latinos, Hispanics, and look like the migrants. There are other issues we face as Puerto Ricans. Puerto Rican families come from Puerto Rico to the US precisely because they can't get services. Yet when they arrive, they are confronted with many of the same issues they faced back home. For example, Puerto Ricans who have children with special needs are facing great obstacles which the diaspora is beginning to take up. Here in New York City, there are instances where there are shortages of staff occupational therapists, speech therapists, and payments to providers of children with special needs. These payments are delayed, which further hinder children getting the services they need and deserve. Poor working class parents struggle to find New York City schools that are accessible for their children with special needs, when many of the city's school buildings are more than 100 years old. According to a report released this past August by Advocates for Children, only 1 in 3 New York City schools are fully accessible to students with physical disabilities. Navigating such a system, if English is not your first language, can become insurmountable, as Puerto Ricans have been discovering. Meanwhile, parents who are affluent can hire legal support and get their children into private schools that offer special education services at a higher quality and with a lower teacher-to-student ratio. There are other grave situations which highlight the impact that colonialism continues to have on both the diaspora and the Puerto Rican people in the archipelago. The question of energy in Puerto Rico has many facets. Although the transmission and the generation of energy was until recently public, it was privatized as a key decision of the Fiscal Control Board, which holds the governmental purse strings of the Puerto Rican colonial government. One issue of grave concern is New Fortress Energy, the parent company of Genera Puerto Rico, which has the potential to run up to 200 liquefied natural gas, quote unquote, bomb trains through working class communities with high concentrations of Puerto Ricans and African Americans here, from Northeast Pennsylvania to the New Jersey shipping terminal. There has been community outcry from diasporic groups like Philly Boricuas and Workers' World on this issue because of the potential for a catastrophe beyond the magnitude of what occurred in East Palestine, Ohio. According to an article published by The Guardian on April 30th, 2023, quote, the Biden administration's transportation department denied a special permit request from gas giant New Fortress Energy that was needed to run up to 200 liquefied natural gas bomb trains through the Northeast Pennsylvania to New Jersey shipping terminal. However, the New Fortress plan is still possible as long as Biden's transit department keeps in place a Trump-era rule allowing liquefied natural gas, or LNG, to be transported by rail through communities of color, particularly communities where there are Puerto Ricans and African Americans. In Puerto Rico, New Fortress Energy supplies natural gas at the terminal in San Juan. During the pandemic, while European demands for energy surged due to the war in the Ukraine, New Fortress, instead of honoring its commitment to supply gas to the archipelago, sold the gas and left the Autoridad de Energía Eléctrica, the Authority of Electrical Energy, that was not yet privatized, scrambling for energy and forced to purchase diesel that incurred an unexpected expense. To date, New Fortress Energy still owes La Autoridad de Energía Eléctrica $34.5 million, adding yet another layer to Puerto Rico's relentless debt. Puerto Rican activists have been persecuted throughout our history, both here and in Puerto Rico, and thus we understand that our voice is critical in denouncing the brutal exploitation and oppression of 125 years of U.S. imperialist rule of Puerto Rico and its consequences for Puerto Ricans here. We have been able to raise the case of Puerto Rico directly to members of U.S. Congress, to protest, and in an important international forum like the United Nations, where we have presented every year the case of Puerto Rico before the UN Decolonization Committee on Puerto Rico. We have also joined with other communities of color with whom we share common conditions of poverty and oppression in the struggles for democratic rights, which has also given us a broader and deeper context to understand our situation here. The diaspora has created and will continue to create organizations and movements that address both our struggle against the colonial status of Puerto Rico and our struggle for democratic rights here in the US. It is important to note that many Puerto Rican political prisoners have been men and women from the diaspora who have risked everything as both community activists fighting for our democratic rights here and as anti-colonial pro-independence fighters. In cases where Puerto Rican political prisoners from Puerto Rico have been shipped to US prisons here, we have formed support committees and continually sought their freedom. Our most recent commitment to Puerto Rico is a campaign aimed at educating and mobilizing to repeal and abolish the Promesa Law. This campaign is called Puerto Rico is not for sale. Puerto Rico no se vende. Joining in solidarity with our people on the island, we will continue working to expose and denounce the junta, the Fiscal Control Board, government corruption, the political harassment of pro-independence activists and mass movements, and the overall worsening quality of life faced by our people because of the U.S. stranglehold on Puerto Rico. I thank you for your time and attention. Que viva Puerto Rico libre.
Thank you very much, Lulu. That was excellent. Que viva Puerto Rico libre. Before I introduce our final speaker, I want to add something that's relevant, which is that the UAW announced this morning that they would be going on strike, the first ever strike, UAW strike, against the three big automakers. And so this, I think, will impact all the peoples of the world that we've been talking about and with during the course of the tribunal, and it may transform the U.S. economy, hopefully for the better.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a former UAW member, just FYI.
Oh, good.
My mom's a former Teamster, so solidarity. And it's noteworthy of noting that they're demanding a massive wage increase because of the massive profits that the car dealers have made over the last several years. So I hope they're able to win. I am honored to introduce our last speaker, Jeanette Grolo, who I had the honor of meeting last spring. Let me pull up the bio. Okay. Jeanette is an associate professor of political science at CUNY Lehman College in New York, where she teaches classical political economy, Latin American development, and globalization history. Her scholarly work focuses on agrarian change, natural resources, and capital accumulation in Marxist and world history perspective. Her works appeared in Journal of Agrarian Change, the Journal of Historical Sociology, Continuity and Change, the International Review of Social History, and Elgar Encyclopedia of Development, among others. Her book, The Underground Wealth of Nations, discusses the mining capital nexus in world history perspective. She's on the member of the editorial board Brill Series Studies in Political Economy of Global Labor and Work. And she's also a member of the International Initiative for the Promotion of Political Economy and the New York Labor International Committee. She's contributed to various institutes and organizations, including the Mining Heritage Trust of Ireland, Institute Europa Subterranea of the Netherlands, and an academy in Austria. With that, I will pass it on to you, Jeanette.
Thank you kindly, Nina. Thank you all for inviting me, and it's a real pleasure and an honor to be here, especially because to all of us Puerto Rican women, islanders, born and raised in Puerto Rico, speaking Spanish, and who have endured some of the history that Lulu and Wilma have described. It's a real honor to be in a panel with these two giants of the Puerto Rican liberation movement. So I want to thank you, and just I want to clarify that that my presentation, or what I would like to discuss today, truly takes much from or builds upon what Lulu and Wilma have described. Briefly for the audience, just to give you an idea, and for the members of this tribunal, just to put the Puerto Rican case in broader hemispheric imperial geopolitical perspective. Think, and Wilma addressed the question of access to information. Think, for example, that when you are completing work on agrarian change, the economics of modernization through convergence, which was the economic policy of the American Empire in Puerto Rico in the 1940s and 1950s, when you want to do research on exactly the economic instruments the empire put in place in order to create underdevelopment in the island so that the American economy could enjoy the benefits of development, you will find yourself kind of in the lion's den. You go to the webpage of the United Nations Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, you go to the webpage of the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. You can go to consult the databases of the World Bank. And if you are trying to build an economic X-ray of the state and situation of the island, you will find that there is nothing compiled by international organizations on the case of Puerto Rico. The few, I think CEPAL, the United Nations Economic Commission on Latin America and Development, the last year, the United Nations did an official economic survey of the economy of the island was 1996. I don't have to say to the members of the Tribunal that much has reigned since then. I believe the UNCTAD, the World Trade Organization, have published occasionally some special papers. But if you want to understand, again, the economics and the financial dimension of the American empire in the territory, the island, and the nation of Puerto Rico, you have to walk back into the lion's den and go to the US Department of Commerce, the statistics compiled by the Army and its various branches, and of course, increasingly and recently, an extraordinary but still small number of think tanks in Puerto Rico and in the US which are addressing the question of economics of empire. So I want to begin with this important observation because it is not just that we Puerto Ricans have very limited access to the information that can reveal the economic mechanisms by which the American empire works in the island, but it is also that my colleagues in Nicaragua, my colleagues in Korea, my colleagues in China, my colleagues in the rest of the global south have very little access to this information too. Now, I want also to give you brief numbers, this is just kind of the state of the Puerto Rican economy at a glance to dispel some myths that are reproduced by the establishment of the American Democratic Party and the establishment of the American Republican Party with respect to the root causes of the economic crisis of the island. The island's economy since 2005 had zero growth rate, none whatsoever. Its annual growth rate was shrinking between 2005 and 2015. These numbers matter because it simply means that long before the Hurricane Maria hit the island, the economic state of the island was in severe crisis. Long before the debt crisis hit the island, which Lulu has described very well, the state of the economy, a peripheral dependent capitalist economy ruled by a colonial government, was already in crisis. Poverty rate of the island, a year before Hurricane Maria hit the island, stood at, according to official statistics compiled by the American government, poverty rate stood at 46%. Now, this is again kind of the rapid state of the economy of the island at a glance to dispel two important myths that truly permeate in political economy literature, in financial newspapers, in economic newspapers, and again, myths that are reproduced by the establishment of the two largest parties here in the US and the ruling class of Puerto Rico. The myth that the crisis of Puerto Rico had a lot to do with hurricanes, the myth that the crisis of Puerto Rico is by default, it's just a crisis that came when China began to compete against the American economy, and the myth that the crisis of Puerto Rico is explained by the so-called problem of tropical corruption. Now, with these numbers at a glance, I would like to propose to the members of this tribunal to look at the case of Puerto Rico, Puerto Rico as the paradigmatic case of what André Gunder Frank called development of underdevelopment. It's the paradigmatic case where the American empire, since day one, and again, Lulu and Wilma explained many dimensions of this phenomenon, but it's the paradigmatic case where the American empire, since day one, literally since 1899, 1898, the American occupation, military occupation, since 1899, the American empire put in place the mechanisms for establishing what I think we can call the twin pillars, the twin foundations of American expansionist project in the hemisphere, not just in Puerto Rico, not just in the Caribbean, but in the hemisphere. And these twin pillars, one obviously had a lot to do with expansion of American industrial capital. In Puerto Rico, the face of industrial capital in the first half of the 20th century it will be the ugliest face of American industrial capital. And the second pillar of the American imperial project on a hemispheric basis is obviously going to be the militarization of the island and the militarization of the region. So very early after the year of military occupation, the American empire is going to build these twin foundations. Now, in terms of how to conceptualize 125 years of economics of empire, I propose to members of this tribunal to look at the underdevelopment of the Puerto Rican economy in three big cycles. The first cycle running roughly until the Second World War or the mid-20th century. This was half a century of American-owned sugar plantation. Half a century, it's monumental, it's shocking. The more you think about these numbers, the more perplexed you are with how good the American empire worked in the island. The first period was the establishment of what I called American-owned latifundio, taking advantage of the political and economic architecture of old Spanish latifundio. The second period was obviously the early 1950s to late 1960s, when the American empire put in place officially a project known as, in the American government documents, a project known as modernization through convergence. Operation Bootstrap was a dimension of this broad project aiming at radically transforming the agrarian fabric of the economy to the benefit of American industrial capital. Make no mistake, it was not to the benefit of any Puerto Rican, to the benefit of American industrial capital. And the last period, entering roughly into the 1970s, but more pronounced into the 1980s, was the period when the American empire, in order to solve domestic problems linked to falling rate of profits of its industries, transformed the deficient industrialization project of the island into a capital-intensive, industrial-driven project. So we are speaking here, this is kind of the 20th century development of underdevelopment of Puerto Rico. Now, given again that Wilma and Lulu have explained much of the post Second World War development, I would like to invite you to move backwards chronologically and begin understanding the economics of empire that were put in place for half a century, and which created truly a perfect capitalist dependent peripheral economy with the intention of becoming the platform for launching the empire's military strategy in Central America and the rest of Latin America. Now, the first 5 decades, what the American empire is going to do, you know, an empire is much more than culture and politics. An empire is a question of economics. Profits are a question of tangible gains. They are always a question of capital and surplus transfer from the periphery to the core. And this is exactly what the empire is going to do very early in 1899. You know, I'll give you a couple of numbers and I'll explain the question of imperial economics during the half a century of sugar plantation economy owned by American capital. And I have, Charlotte, if you can kindly show the second slide, please. I have a map there just to show you some why this period matters. Just the second slide. Thank you, Charlotte. But we are speaking here that the American empire is going to build, is going to feel attracted to, obviously, raw materials. I don't know if you can see you see the map there? Okay, perfect. The American empire is going to feel attracted to Central America, Puerto Rico, the Caribbean archipelago, Mexico, right? It's a tricky geographic question, right? If it belongs to North or Central America. But the American empire is going to feel attracted to this region for the geological and geographic bounties of the region. Now, in the case of Puerto Rico had something that allowed the Rockefellers, the Van Cortlands, and many other families here in New York to make a fortune. And this is what they called white gold. Now, this map right here shows you what I call the empire's sugar archipelago. Make no mistake, the American empire did in Puerto Rico very early in the year 1898, 1 month after the signing of the Treaty of Paris, 1 month after the signing of the Treaty of Paris in August between McKinley and Spain. The first thing the American empire did in order to build rapidly the conditions for the expansion of monoculture and the conditions for specialization of Puerto Rico as an exporter of refined and raw sugar, the first thing the American empire did was to devalue the silver peso. Now, the silver peso, Charlotte, can you let me see? Okay. The silver peso, this was the currency used in Central American markets, used in Caribbean markets for settling balances of trade, for making money, for establishing trade. Now, the American empire, by law, Congress is going to pass a law that is going to devalue the silver peso and force the American dollar as the only currency acceptable for domestic and regional transactions of the colony. Now, this might not mean much to us here in the 21st century, right? But if we go back, again, if we move back chronologically, it means that what the American empire is going to do is going to radically, but legally, is going to legally lower the value of commercial land, giving American capitalists a rapid advantage. The valuation of the silver peso lowered the value of agrarian land in the island. All coastal land of the island is going to belong to American capitalists specializing in sugar mills until 1950s. This is truly impressive. Not only the Americans legalized usurpation of land and a violent dispossession of land, but they are going to increasingly indebt Puerto Rican traders, merchants, landowners, they are going to increasingly indebt them because their debts were now valued in US dollars. Just to give you an idea, by January 1899, the US empire, January 1899, where no single American industrialist, American capitalist, not enough time for them to plant anything in any of these lands. By January 1899, the US empire has transferred smoothly the amount of 5.75 million pesos from the island into its domestic economy. You might want to say silver pesos did not matter much then. I recommend members of the tribunal to think globally in terms of movements of money. The policy is going to allow the American capitalists not only to monopolize land, to lower the value of land. It created rapidly a rush, a speculative rush for the best available lands there. But the speculative rush took place in New York, in Philadelphia, in Baltimore, and Chicago. And on top of that, is going to allow the American capital to deliver a mortal blow to what was left of British monetary supremacy in the Caribbean. So immediately, this is a policy that is going to allow you to understand why American capital placed a great strategic emphasis on taking hold of these lands. So Puerto Rico is going to enter the 20th century as a colony of the US, with debts, land debts valued in US dollars, an extraordinary, robust, profitable market for land speculation, and of course, a weakened bourgeoisie ruling class, but already fully integrated to the New York Stock Exchange, Philadelphia, Boston, and the banks here in the mainland, which were trading with the land of the island. Now, a couple of characteristics of this agrarian capital that obviously this is among other reasons, this is what puts us closer to Central America. Even if, I must say here for this tribunal, even if many Puerto Ricans don't think of themselves as part of Central America, but this gives us a historic bond of solidarity with the agrarian struggles and the peasantry of Central America, because not only absentee American capitalists owned coastal lands of the island, absentee American capitalists, but what we are going to see is a dramatic expansion of monoculture. By 1929, 82% of all lands planted with sugarcane belonged only to 8 sugar mill factories owned by American industrialists based right here in the mainland. By 1942, when there is already a dramatic transformation of the urban fabric of the mainland, by 1942, the economy of Puerto Rico was entirely agrarian. By 1942, 50% of its exported crops were obviously sugar. 50% of land was devoted to sugar. But the 50% of the surface land of the island that was planted with sugar, this 50% represented 82% of all commercially valuable land of the island. You have to imagine that then this is going to be half a century where this is only one side of the coin. The other side is going to be one of the worst maladies of underdevelopment that the Puerto Rican economy suffers from, and that very few economists want to address. High dependency upon imported food. By 1935, 50% in an agrarian economy. By 1935, 50% of all food consumed by Puerto Ricans came from abroad. In 2014, 2015, the last statistics I was checking the other day, it was 85% of all food consumed came from abroad. Now, you have to imagine then that until the 1950s, right, the principal exports of the island were strictly agrarian commodities, raw and refined sugar, tobacco, coffee, increasingly cotton, linen, and some silk manufactures. There is a pejorative term that some political economists use, and I see their names here in this bookshelf. This is what you would call a banana republic. This is what you would call a banana republic. Now, what we are witnessing here in this period is the beginnings of economic relations that created pauperization of Puerto Ricans. I have here notes of a letter written. I'm going to read it briefly to you. It's short. A letter written by a famous politician of the island, dated 30th of September, 1942. It's a letter actually curiously held by, it's only found in the archives of the American Federation of Labor. That's just a footnote. But it's a letter addressed to the chairman of the War Labor Board. He's a Puerto Rican politician. And the letter says the following: hunger among the employed as well as the unemployed is rapidly reaching a point of serious danger, both psychologically and physically. As a representative of my people, Puerto Rico, I appeal to your goodwill to help us find a part of the solution that must be found to this problem. This is again a letter dated 30th of September, 1942. It only means that the monoculture, the agrarian capital that engulfed the island in the first half of a century, the first 50 years of American occupation of the island, created pauperization and truly pushed the island, truly cemented the conditions for the rise of what we call peripheral dependent capitalist development. Now, I want to mention two more details about this period, just because here are the economic foundations of empire. The economic foundations, here you find the unsettled questions of underdevelopment of the island. This pauperization, when you looked at the working class, what did the working class of Puerto Rico look like in 1940s versus the working class of the US? This is where you truly see development of the American economy and underdevelopment of the colony as two sides of one single coin, the coin of capitalist development under the leadership of the American empire. You know, Hawaii, the archipelago of sugar production of the empire, Hawaii, Philippines, no other territory had what Puerto Rico had to offer to the empire. First, Puerto Rico had, and this has a lot to do with developments of the 19th century, but Puerto Rico had small-scale farmers that planted sugar cane, and which American corporations engaged as, the American corporations gave them contracts, and they were legally recognized as colonos. Colonos is a term that admits of no English translation, by the way. American capitalists spoke in terms of colonos. Colonos were small-scale farmers planting and tilling land, less than 10 acres of land each, who sold their cane to the different sugar mill factories established along the coast of the island. I'm taking for granted that all of you are familiar with the basic geography, basic topography of the island, but you have here It's an island, obviously, right? It has the range of mountains in the middle, and it is truly surrounded by coastal plains. This is important. So corporations are established in the coastal plains, American corporations, and small-scale farmers come and go as they engage in economic relations with these corporations. Now, these contracts granted colonos, Puerto Rican farmers, a year-by-year contract. This is what corporations did. Colonos had to go, bring their sugar cane to the corporation, and bring the sugar cane to the corporation, which obviously the American corporation paid for. Now, the legal side of the contract, and I know many members of this tribunal are lawyers, the legal side of the contract is where the predatory economic of empires starts to crawl in, because the legal side of the contract established that there was no fixed, determined certain price for the yield. American capitalists paid for sugar based upon two variables unknown to the Puerto Rican farmer. The first variable was obviously market price per ton of sugar, and this was a question of global economics of sugar markets. And the second important economic variable was the yield per cane brought by Puerto Rican farmers. So you have to imagine that the outcome was not just massive transfer of surplus from the colony to the empire, but also a dynamic and quite violent process of ruralization of an incipient proletariat. Now, this system is going to obviously entail many contradictions, but what is going to truly force the empire to build and cover it with a second wave of expansion, where I believe factors taking place in Puerto Rico, in the Caribbean, and in Central America. In 1930s, 1940s, these are times of turmoil in Central America. Turmoil began earlier. There were American politicians here who in 1930s wrote about the need to rapidly modernize plantations to address, and this is not my phrase, I'm not that clever to invent this phrase I take from American documents, the need to modernize rapidly the American-owned plantations in Puerto Rico as to address the Bolshevik threat. Now, the Bolshevik threat obviously was related to many developments now regionally. And in order to understand the contradictions, challenges, and limitations of this model, we do have to open the borders and look at Puerto Rico in the context of Central America. In 1930s, early 1930s, we have Sandino in Nicaragua. We have other guerrilla movements in the region. We had the Third International. We have the rise of the Puerto Rican Communist Party in 1935. We had the rise of the Movimiento Obrero in Puerto Rico earlier, decades earlier, which I must say, this is one of the things that make you feel proud of your own history. I must say the Movimiento Obrero in Puerto Rico was one of the earliest militant labor unions that was openly anti-imperialist. We had in the rest of Latin America, the Confederación Sindical Latinoamericana. This was a fantastic confederation of incipient labor unions in Central America, where American capital had interests in the latifundio of the region. This confederation put in place a fantastic challenge against what it called the trades unionism of the American Federation of Labor. So we are going to have the rise of militant miners' parties in South America. And we know that the American capitalists and American politicians made these systemic connections They connected the stability of their colony, Puerto Rico, to these developments because such were the words of President Truman. President Truman established the Point Four doctrine. I'm not going to read the most important tenets of the doctrine, but those of you familiar with American history know that the Point Four doctrine, launched by Truman, was a hemispheric policy that targeted Puerto Rico, but the idea was, and these are the words, I think I have a quote here by Truman. The idea was to turn Puerto Rico, that Puerto Rico had to be, I think the word in English, perhaps someone can help me here, the word we use in Spanish is vitrina, but to turn Puerto Rico into the showcase for Latin America, that American capital was capable of delivering progress, eradicating poverty, if and only if American capital found in host countries good allies. Let me just read you briefly how President Truman put it in 1940s and why this triggered the second wave of economic development of the island. What we are going to...
This is brilliant.
But
I'm
1 minute.
give you
Okay.
maybe 2 to 3. Just wrap up.
No, I want to read this.
You.
Good. I want to read the words by Truman because this is what the empire is going to truly put the twin pillars: economics of empire, transfer of surplus, plus militarization. This is going to take another level. Briefly, this is words from Truman, 1947, when he presented his policy to Congress. Bipartisan Congress, by the way, everybody agreed with this approach. Okay. The seeds of totalitarian governments are nurtured by misery and want. They spread and grow in the evil soil of poverty and strife. They reach their full growth when the hope of a people for a better life has died. We must keep that hope alive. The free peoples of the world look to us for support in maintaining their freedoms. This is going to be the grand imperialist framework for the process of industrialization that Lulu and Wilma have already described. And the outcome is going to be obviously an economy, again, engulfed in underdevelopment. Puerto Rico was never the Switzerland of the Caribbean, amidst that the ruling class of Puerto Rico and the establishment here in the US, amidst that they have sold to the rest of Latin America. It has not gone, right? The myth has not really yielded the gains the American empire expected. And with this, I'd like to thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That was a brilliant discussion and panel, everybody. I'm going to pass it to our steering committee member, Karina Mullen.
Great. Thank you so much, Nina. And I just want to thank again all of our expert witnesses for those really powerful presentations detailing the racist oppression, dispossession, militarization, exploitation, and subordination of the Puerto Rican people, land, and economy by US colonialism and imperialist capitalism. And also for so brilliantly describing how Puerto Ricans have historically and continue to resist in coalition with other oppressed peoples here in the belly of the beast and elsewhere in the global South, including the calls that we, of course, support for independence and reparations. So I just want to thank you again for those really, really brilliant, powerful presentations. So I think without further ado, we'll open up now to questions. We have some amazing jurors with us here today, including Jerry Boohill, Michael Deutsch, and Susan Adderley. And I see we already have a hand up. So please, Michael.
Okay, I want to thank the panelists, the experts for very informative presentations. I wonder how you would assess the present strength of the independence movement and what do you see as its future prospects? That's for anyone that wants to answer that.
Oh, if Lulu wants to go first, or you want me to go first, Lulu? Yeah,
Mhm.
or Janet?
No, yes, go
Uh,
first.
Okay, thank you. Well, right now, I am living in a state of hope because the new generations that are rising up are really giving us lesson on how to do the struggle for independence. There's a whole new way of approaching first the discourse, the speeches that we give uh, as independence leaders in terms of really talking to the people about their most basic needs in terms that they can relate how it's important not to be under colonialism. For example, the whole question of the canasta básica, what that we say in Spanish, the grocery, the basic grocery that people, a family should have, how the Jones Act that makes us bring all our food in U.S. flag ships, as Janet has brilliantly described. Uh, the fact that we are importing 85% of what we have to eat when we were an agrarian economy that we even exported food. Now we are completely dependent on US, and who is the basic most important shopping center for the people with the less economic advantages? Walmart. So that's the reality in Puerto Rico in terms of how the young people that one of the other aspects that gives me a lot of hope, the agriculture in Puerto Rico has been almost completely disappeared by the U.S. At one time when it was the most important production in Puerto Rico, but right now I think it doesn't represent more than a 4%. But this new generation had understood the importance of going back to the land. And there's this whole group of young people who are working the land and producing healthy food for consumption. And of course, I would like that to be like tenfold multiplication. But what I see that is happening right now give us a lot of hope that agriculture could really be developed. It takes time, it takes generations to develop agriculture to be able to be self-sustainable again. But this is a matter very important because the food, the lack of food is an emergency for any nation. And we saw that after the passing of Hurricane Maria, when the ships on the United States could not come into the ports because the ports were filled with vessels that had been damaged by the hurricane. And so you will go to a supermarket when you could go because you didn't have gas to put on the on the car, in the car to go to the supermarket. But when you can actually do it, all the shelves were almost empty because the US ships could not come into the island. So agriculture is a very strategically important sector for the Puerto Rican people to develop. And there's a lot of self entrepreneurs, young people. They are of course, they do not tend to organize themselves, for example, around the issue of independence itself. They organize themselves around specific issues like the food emergency or the environmental aspects, all the struggle right now to defend our coast, and the beaches and the maritime resources, but through that organization in those themes, they have gained a lot of conscience of how important it is to once and for all be a self-sustaining nation and not to be under the yoke of U.S. imperialism. So there's also new ways of doing politics in the independence movement that go from very radical groups that are doing, I think, a very important job, like the people, the young people from the Jornadas Acabaron las Promesas. We have the people who have organized politically through the electoral system in Movimiento Victoria Ciudadana, the fact that the candidate for the Puerto Rico Independence Party that had failed to be ¿cómo se dice? Inscrito, inscribed. I'm going to, because they had not obtained sufficient votes. Well, this last election, they got a 16% of the vote for the candidate for governor. So it goes from very radical actions to very, we will say, establishment actions, but that when you put everything together, you see that the new generations are really questioning the whole colonial system and are showing us the old generations new ways to keep on the struggle.
Thank you so much for that overview of the independence movement, Wilma. I'm wondering, does Lula or Jeanette, would you like to come in? And then I see Jerry Boo will come to you next.
I would
Oh,
like
yeah,
to add.
Go ahead, Lulu. Yeah.
I would like to add that in the same way that U.S. imperialism has impacted Puerto Rico negatively, it has also created an ongoing relationship between the diaspora and Puerto Rico and the movements here, which have impacted the movements in Puerto Rico. For example, there is a greater understanding of and a greater struggle against homophobia, right? Against the misogyny and attacks and violence against women. There is an intersection now of race and class happening within this younger generation that we didn't see in previous movements necessarily, and coming together as different sectors of society that are exploited or oppressed, discriminated against, is creating a very dynamic and different Puerto Rican movement, social movement for justice and social change that we had not seen before. And as Wilma said, thus, employing different levels and different means of struggles that we have not had before. Of course, we're working in a century that has, the social media, it has internet, etc., that we didn't have back in the 70s and 80s. We had to do everything by hand. But this has certainly rapidly made information available, not only between the US and Puerto Rico, but on an international scale, where the young people of Puerto Rico are learning from what's happening with other countries and the younger generations in other countries. How are they organizing? What are they doing? And this is an important and exciting, and as Wilma said, something that gives us great hope. I also want to say that, at one time, you couldn't even discuss colonialism in Puerto Rico or even use the word. Now it's understood that Puerto Rico is a colony. There is, however, different reactions to what that means, right? When we say Puerto Rico is a colony, we want independence. When the stateholders say Puerto Rico is a colony, they say Puerto Rico can become decolonized by becoming a state. And when the current status quo people, the PPD says, yes, Puerto Rico is a colony, but we can become, an enhanced commonwealth or a free associated. So everybody acknowledges that Puerto Rico is a colony, but how we decolonize is where we very profoundly differ, with us maintaining that it's independence that decolonizes us. And that there is no equality between the US and Puerto Rico as we stand. The only way we can be equal is as independent nations, developing our own economies, establishing our own trade, and working within the region that we belong to, the Latin America and Caribbean region.
If I can briefly comment, Michael, if I may, your question is a tough one. Your question is a tough one, and I agree with everything Lulu and Wilma have said. But I am going to add that for my generation, I'm joining the Puerto Rican struggle from a different angle. I'm learning and trying to build upon what previous generations have done. I belong to other movements, but we come from the recognition that under the conditions of the capitalist world economy, self-determination must lead to socialism. It is not possible to develop. Development is a myth. It doesn't exist. Development belongs to the Western economies. Development is an ideological device of the Western economies. So there are people like us who argue that it's whatever path self-determination takes, the horizon is socialism, or else we will never leave behind the root of the problem, which is capitalist, dependent, peripheral. This is where we are. And this is a horizon, I must say. This is, again, what puts us closer to the rest of the global South. The quest for socialism is not unique to Puerto Rico. It belongs to all other economies who have realized painfully that again, the Ricardian myth of development, that you develop agriculture and then develop industry and then develop finance and service, that's an imperial illusion. So, this is, your question is kind of, it's not a low-fat, low-calorie question, because people like us, we argue that if there is no socialism entailed, then we'll have to quarrel with respect to the model of self-determination, as Lulu and Wilma basically have stated.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that, Jeanette, Lulu, and Wilma. I know we've got a question from Jerry Boohill. Please go ahead, Jerry.
I don't have a question so much as I have just a statement of solidarity and love and relief that finally the myths and illusions are being exposed, because the bourgeoisie, in whatever stripe it comes in, they constantly peddle this notion that Puerto Rico, if it is to be free, it needs to be a state. Why on earth are people buying and selling that? It's because we don't have access to the truth. So thank you, sisters, for lifting up the truth about this project, this failing project that has soaked up and dragged so many of us down. And now we're seeing the light. And victory to young people, to young revolutionaries who are on the path to keeping us on the path of consciousness and honesty, so we can not fall back into the trap again and go to these illusions. And I love imperial illusions. Thank you so much, Jeanette, for that.
Yes, an excellent term. Thank you for that, Jeanette. And thank you, Jerry Boo. Great, inspiring words. I think we do have another question from, unfortunately, one of our jurists had to leave, but I'll ask her question as long as keeping an eye on time. I know we don't have much time, and we also do have a question from the Q&A box. So I'll ask Suzanne Adeli's question first, and then I'll move on to Mark Ginsburg's question, and then I'll give each of the expert witnesses a chance to respond to both of these questions before we end. So Suzanne's question was, can you provide more information on the corporations, investors that have profited from the land grab and exploitation of the agricultural sector? Suzanne is also interested in the extent in the state of U.S. surveillance and repression of the Puerto Rican independence movement today. And then the question from Mark Ginsburg is, please discuss what motivates some Puerto Ricans to vote against independence. So those are three questions. Who would like to begin? Would someone like to begin, or I can ask? Lulu, would you like to begin?
I think there were several questions in one, right? No, I was going to say, I wanted Jeanette to answer. I think she can answer more lucidly and more clearly the question regarding investments, right? Who are the investors in the land? And I'd like to hear that also from Jeanette.
Yeah, I think I wrote something to Susan in the chat, but the capital, there is a list of corporations that we have tracked, right? There's a group of basically 11 corporations that we have tracked in this period, right? American industrial capital is going to change, and in the 1970s and 80s, there is going to be other names. But these are corporations that had, and again, I'll send Susan later the list. But these are corporations that, to give the rest of you an idea, these are corporations that established the refineries. This is impressive. The refineries right here in New York, in the lower Manhattan, moved to Brooklyn, from Brooklyn to New Jersey, and in other cities and states of the Northeast. So there is this is a list of corporations. I need to say something briefly. There are only two authoritative American studies on the American plantation system in Puerto Rico, one done in 1933 by what I consider a right-wing, ideologically inclined think tank, very popular today. It continues to work on the service of the empire. That's the Brookings Institute. And the second one, a more noble effort by an American economist at the Boston University. And I'll provide Susan later with this information. But yes, this is studied, the numbers are there, the names are there, so yes.
Great, thank you for that, Jeanette, and we look forward to receiving those additional materials. Would Wilma or Lulu like to go to speak to this question, either of the specific corporations or about surveillance and repression, if that's something that you'd like to speak to?
On this first question, I would like to mention the presence of Monsanto in Puerto Rico, which has taken hundreds and hundreds of acres to do their nasty experimental thing. You know that Monsanto is so, I don't understand how the international community has allowed that seeds that somebody can claim property rights on seeds. And for example, you know that what they did in Mexico with the NAFTA is that they made the Mexican agriculture had to, by certain time, they had to move from their perfectly natural organic products into these Monsanto seed products, for which they were going to charge them for the seeds when they had their own seeds that they didn't have to pay anybody. And not only that, if the seeds were flown by air into your land and they sprouted, then Monsanto will come after you that you had to pay royalties because they used your seed. And so Monsanto has a big operation going on in Puerto Rico with the land in all these agricultural experiment. Now in Puerto Rico, from the agricultural perspective, that is the greatest menace. Then what I mentioned before, the presence of the Walmarts in Puerto Rico, which is the main shopping center for food for the people here. And the presence, Puerto Rico used to have like 1,600 community pharmacies. Now I don't think there's more than 600 left because of the invasion of CVS and Walgreens into Puerto Rico. So these are just a few of the usual suspects that I can name of it. I imagine Lulu wants to add something. Then I would like to talk about a little bit more about the repression.
Just to say that Monsanto is also a threat to farmers in this country for the very same reason that, you know, these sterile seeds, because they are sterile, they're not what are known as heirloom seeds. They're sterile seeds that cannot be reproduced. And farmers in this country have been fighting also with Monsanto when these seeds get blown over or carried by birds. Birds carry seeds and drop them wherever. And then these seeds sprout and Monsanto then takes them to court. I just wanted to add, after Hurricane Maria, I was sending containers and containers and containers of organic heirloom seeds to Puerto Rico to different projects. In Lares, where there is a cooperative of farmers, they are socialists, they are pro-independence farmers who started a cooperative in Lares, and I sent them seeds that they are still have to this day. I also sent seeds to Vieques, which they had a huge farmland that was being used as a cooperative, and Vieques was devastated, and I sent them seeds, and I sent seeds to a project in Ponce. So, you know, that's another way that we contribute to the process of reseeding our island, just getting a hold of something as basic as organic heirloom seeds to combat, you know, to help local projects and to combat Monsanto.
Yeah. One another thing about Monsanto, in Puerto Rico, there is a 500 acres law that you're not supposed to have more than 500 acres that was adopted to fight against the monocultivism and the land grabbing by the U.S. interest. But Monsanto has thousands of land, but what they do is they put them under different corporation names. And no, it's not Monsanto, it's, you know, whatever name they invent, and they keep on grabbing land. Now, on the repression, I think this is one of the most important aspects that we have to repeatedly bring to the attention of people, because since I've done a lot of international work, always in one of the presentations, there's always somebody from the international community, especially our Latin American brothers and sisters, that stand up and say, and why haven't the people in Puerto Rico fought for their independence? They say, well, I think that the premise of your question is completely wrong. We have been fighting for independence for 125 years against the US and several centuries against Spain. And so just briefly, in the first part of the invasion of the US, they were not greeted like one of the state secretary over here said that the US had been invited into Puerto Rico and were greeted by the people of Puerto Rico. That is not true. The US invaded, it was a military occupation, and there were people who rebelled and fought against the military occupation, but of course, they were facing the greatest army in the world, so they could not prevail. And in the 30s, when the Nationalist Party gained a lot of sympathy in the population, led by Pedro Albizu Campos, what they did is that they incarcerated the whole leadership of the independence of the Nationalist movement. And as I mentioned before, they concentrated in trying to eliminate Pedro Albizu's Campo by exposing him to radiation while he was in jail. And that's an egregious crime that has to be repeated and denounced every time you have an opportunity. And after Don Pedro was our leader until his death in the 1960s. Then in the second half of the 20th century, we have the Puerto Rican Socialist Party. Well, first the MPI, Movimiento Pro Independencia, which was founded in 1959, and that then became in the 70s in the Puerto Rican Socialist Party. We had the Liga Socialista led by Juan Antonio Correger, and of course the Puerto Rican Independence Party that was created in the 1946 or 37. When in that period, after the nationalist movement was incarcerated and persecuted, and there was also disappearance of some of their leaders, the movement then became the Movimiento Pro Independencia and Liga Socialista were more radical, were socialists, as the name says. In fact, Juan Antonio Correger came from the nationalist movement. He used to be their secretary. He was incarcerated the first time because he refused to give all the minutes of the meetings of the Nationalist Party to the federal government. So that was the 60s and the 70s. We find a very radical socialist active movement in Puerto Rico, which had very strong ties with the Cuban Revolution, and that was triggered the COINTERPROV operation in Puerto Rico. That's when they started destabilizing. For example, Juan Maribras' son was assassinated, and they tried to make us believe that it was an isolated, deranged person, but it was not. We have never believed that. We believe that this was part of an FBI operation on the COINTERPRO to get at the psychological and emotional state of Juan Maribras, who had become a very important spokesman for the Puerto Rican independence movement internationally, and who had very close tie with the Cuban Revolution, with Fidel, and with Salvador Allende in Chile, etc. So he suffered a heart attack as a consequence of the assassination of his son, but he never rendered himself until his last breath. He continued fighting for the independence of Puerto Rico. He died in 2010. And Juan Antonio Correger was also persecuted, incarcerated several times, and kept very close vigilance of him and all the people who participated in La Liga Socialista, and several of them had also spent some time in jail. So the repression of the independence movement has been there since day one of the U.S. invasion of Puerto Rico, and it has not ceased up to today. What happened in the 80s when the incarceration of the compañeros from the FALN and of the Ejército Popular Boricua, the assassination of Filiberto, the way they were treated in jail, and also, of course, the nationalists in the 1950s, Oscar Collazo, who was my uncle, Lolita Lebrón, Rafael Cancel Miranda, Andrés Figueroa Cordero, Silvin Flores. I mean, we have paid with blood and sweat for the struggle for independence of Puerto Rico. And Puerto Ricans have been fighting for the independence always, and we are still fighting today.
Yeah. Corina, can I say something adding to Wilma, because this is and what Lulu have said, this is exceedingly important. Michael, I'm sorry, it looks as if we are taking it with you, but you know, the struggle, Wilma is absolutely correct. This is not a political interpretation of reality. This is history. You know, perhaps the shortest answer to the question, the shortcut to the question, why the problem of the political formulation of independence? You need to find it in the Upper West Side in Columbia University. The first thing the American government did after Operation Bootstrap, or while coinciding with Operation Bootstrap, actually not the American government, Rockefeller ordered the American government and gave a blank check to a sociology professor there, an anthropologist, Julian Stewart. Many of you know his name. Julian Stewart became the leading architect of a pilot project in Puerto Rico to use Puerto Rico as an anthropological model on how to educate, modernize the peasants into the American way of life. The Julian paperworks are in an archive. This is not an invention, it's not an interpretation. And part of the ideological goals of the project were explicitly to get rid of anything smelling and looking like nationalism. Wilma is describing a real history. This is why the case of Puerto Rico is unique, and I believe it presents unique challenges and unique questions for this tribunal. Not only that, the case of Puerto Rico became, you know, it was supposed to be the anthropological model that the American government was going to use in Bolivia, with the revolutions and the radicalized miners of Bolivia in the 1950s, but also in the revolution or mini revolution in Guatemala. So it's the case of Puerto Rico, the siege of the American empire against the nationalist movement is real, is still in the making. And this means for us, Puerto Rican nationalist socialists, that, you know, the word nationalism in the US has different connotations. This was a bourgeois republic since day one. Now, that's a legacy, that's a historical legacy that we'll have to deal with. But we refuse to give the ruling class and the right wing the word nationalism. We believe in revolutionary nationalism, and we are going for it.
Can I just add that in terms of the current situation, yes, the FBI is very active in Puerto Rico. And not only regarding the Puerto Rican movement, but also Puerto Rico's solidarity with other countries like Cuba. Recently, there's the Puerto Rican brigade that does solidarity work with Cuba returned and had the FBI monitoring their telephones, visiting them in their homes, following them, etc. And Wilma can speak to them as an attorney, because Wilma has been one of the attorneys, along with other attorneys in Puerto Rico, who have dedicated countless pro bono hours to getting people out of jail, to following their trails, etc. We've had people from Se Acabaron las Promesas who have been, you know, imprisoned briefly for brief periods of time, but the ongoing political harassment is real. And it is aimed at debilitating the movement. It is aimed at demoralizing the movement. It targets the way that repression has always been in Puerto Rico, just like the Puerto Rican movement here, is to target leaders, target people who are seen as leaders, target the main structures of the organizations or movements in order to destabilize us and to stop us from mobilizing, to stop us from denouncing. And that continues to be a very, very powerful tactic that the FBI uses whenever it feels like it in Puerto Rico. The repression is also, we can also see it in the level of militarization of the police force of Puerto Rico. You see the police have these huge shields. They have military weapons that they are using, because, you know, the military in this country has a surplus. So sure, let's send it out, right? They send it to the police departments here in the United States, where we see greater militarization of the cops here, right? We saw that in the different demonstrations that were taking place up until recently, but you also see it in Puerto Rico, a greater militarization of the police force. So it's both the FBI and the police force and the National Guard that contributes at different times in different ways to the repression of the Puerto Rican movement and of the mass movements of Puerto Rico, not just the independence movement, the mass movements. People, you know, teachers struggling for pension benefits, you know, youth arguing and debating and struggling for to preserve the University of Puerto Rico, which is supposed to be a public university. All of these different struggles, mass struggles, has at some point or another been confronted with the physical repression of the police force, or with the constant destabilization tactics of the FBI.
Thank you so much for that. Thank you, Lula, Wilma, and Jeanette. I know we are running out of time, and I want to thank you all, the jurors, as well as the expert witnesses. I know you all have busy schedules, so we really appreciate you taking time to join us today. Thank you for those the excellent questions, as well as these enlightening responses. And as Nina said at the beginning, the impact of U.S. colonial imperialist policies designed to secure the oppression, dispossession, dependency, and surplus value transfer from Puerto Rico to the U.S. imperialist core parallel and intersect in so many ways with those of the sanctions and blockades that we've learned about throughout this tribunal. So your testimonies have been incredibly helpful for us, for the jurors and special rapporteurs, to really think through these connections. And thank you again. So thank you. I just want to thank you so much to our amazing expert witnesses for your powerful presentations and all that you do to advance this noble struggle. And I also want to thank, of course, our amazing jurors, as well as Nina and Helia, and the co-chairs of the tribunal, as well as the entire tribunal steering committee, and everyone who helped to organize this hearing, as well as the tribunal. And I'm so honored to be a part of this, and happy that this was our last hearing. And I see, Nina, you've got your hand raised. Go for it.
No, that was a mistake. I wanted to raise a fist or a heart for what you were saying. But thank you also to Karina. We also should thank Karina and all the other steering committee members.
Wonderful. Thank you all. Que viva Puerto Rico libre.
Viva, que viva.